Hi, my name is Jennifer Rittner. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really delighted to be here with Ifeoma Ebo and Jose Ortiz Jr. I want to start because as we're talking about building equity within our spaces, we have to begin by acknowledging the land of the five boroughs that make up New York City are the traditional homelands of the Lenape, the Merrick, the Canarsie, the Matinecock, and the Rockaway nations. Despite systemic erasures, these lands persist as intertribal trade lands under the stewardship of many nations and over 115,000 intertribal Native American, First Nations, and Indigenous peoples who currently call New York City home. So as we're going to discuss the equitable city, we have to consider what it means to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, which I believe is our collective ethical responsibility. And in addition, the three of us here today, and many who I hope are with us virtually, have to acknowledge those of us who are here because our ancestors were brought here against their free will, and whose tremendous cultural, economic, and technological contributions continue to be the legacy we all carry. Ifeoma Ebo and Jose Ortiz, the original title for this talk from my notes from a few months ago was Designing Cities to Eradicate Inequality. And I was really struck by the power of that word, eradication, which, like abolition, is in fact more concise and demands more urgency than what I think we ended up with, which is fairer living. So I wanted to talk about how eradicating inequality relies on civic participation in the practices of design, workforce development, urban planning, policymaking, and then to learn from both of you what civic participation looks like in your particular practices. So I'm going to start by just asking, and maybe Ifeoma, you can start us off, is how do you conceptualize equity at this particular moment? And what do you consider to be your philosophy of equitable design and practice that guides your particular work?
Thank you so much for that brilliant question, Jennifer. And thank you to the 92Y for just the opportunity to be a part of this really timely discussion amongst brilliant people. So my thoughts on that is, in terms of equity, I think equity is definitely rooted in need. It's not rooted in, distributing the equal amounts to everyone, but really thinking about what is the need in place. And it's contextual, it's place-based. And so when you're thinking about this idea of fair living, it's imperative to understand what is the need of place. And the only way you can really understand that is to talk to people and learn from their lived experience. And yes, we can look at data. Yes, we can look at mapping, but the lived experience is also data to use and be influenced by. And so, when thinking about decision-making, when thinking about designing, recreating spaces, it's important in all of those arenas to really strive to understand what is the needs of place, not only in terms of science and technology, but also in terms of just the inherent needs on the ground for the people that have been living in those experiences. And so in my work, ways of engaging people is first to really think about the people on the margins. Who are the people that don't have the loudest voices, who perhaps have not been brought to the table in decision making, and who perhaps have been historically marginalized and haven't had a space to really amplify their voice. And that is really, I think, a starting point, because once you really address the issues of the most vulnerable, those who have not had a voice, you're really creating great spaces for everyone. And that's just in a context of just myself as an architect and planner. But, when you're really striving to address the needs of those that are most vulnerable, you really address the needs of everyone.
Yeah, I'm really struck by your calling up the most vulnerable and how important it is for us to see that the lived experience is a part of one's expertise that will inform what equitable practices look like. Jose, what does that look like for you? How do you contextualize it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the statements. And first off, again, thank you to 92Y for inviting me to participate here with you both. When it comes to our work specifically at NYC-ETC, which is the New York City Employment and Training Coalition, we specialize primarily in workforce and economic development. But for us, that means connecting people to skills, training, and education needed to thrive in an economy and not just to survive. And when we say thrive, that boosts not just their household, but also their communities and our shared economy and space and cities. Everything is connected. And we believe very much so in terms of the notion of intersectionality and that it's not just about work, but it's about housing. It's about food security. It's about other things that exist in the community that are often fractured, particularly for folks who are considered underserved or marginalized. And this past year and year and a half, in fact, we partner with two specific organizations. One, the Association for Neighborhood Housing and Development, and the Regional Plan Association, two incredible organizations focused on one, housing and economic development, the other on economic development, resiliency, infrastructure. And we created an initiative actually called the Inclusive Growth Initiative, together with the support of a 19-person steering committee of individuals that were emerging in their individual spaces. Some of the spaces that I previously mentioned around food security, housing, but others like disabilities and accessibilities, infrastructure, climate and resiliency, racial and social justice, gender equity, lots of other areas. And the purpose of selecting this diverse set of expertise was to really imagine what a fairer city can look like from the perspective of people who have lived experiences and expertise in a variety of different areas that impact how a city grows and is redeveloped or developed. And so while the project itself is anchored on housing, economic development, and workforce development, it is really more thoroughly informed by the other areas that are often not included into that discussion. And so you could actually receive more information on that at inclusivegrowth.nyc and learn a lot more about those pillar areas. But one thing that we can do immediately that will affect all of these elements in connecting New York City's workforce development system to local economic development projects, including real estate development, projects sponsored by public agencies like the New York City Economic Development Corporation and local development agencies. And we have, like I mentioned, countless recommendations. In fact, I think we have about 5 dozen recommendations in these 3 individual areas that have been developed by, both of our organizations and that steering committee, which was incredible. But there's a lot more to be done here to ensure that we're not, that we're rejecting trickle down and really embracing a bottom up approach.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm really struck by the transdisciplinary nature of these coalitions. And, coming from the design space, one of the real challenges in design is people coming in design who see themselves as experts trying to make things new rather than plugging into the work that's already happening. And I think what you just named, just like the list of resources you just named, really show how much deep work is happening in communities, both at a local scale and I think more, right, sort of at these increasing scales. Ifeoma, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what organizations, institutions, individuals you're also intersecting with in your work.
Oh my goodness, there's really a great, and I'm so proud of just the number of organizations that have grown and developed at this time, and also the ones that are developing. Definitely one I can talk about is, a few of them that I can talk about is the Association for Community Design. It's a coalition of architects and planners really striving for equity and justice in the built environment. And they're having a conference this weekend. And I think what's so interesting about that organization is really thinking about the intersections, because addressing equity is really about multiple disciplines coming together and not just in one, and not operating in silos, but really thinking about what happens at the intersection. That's one. Another is Dark Matter University, which is an organization that's really trying to influence academia and what we're learning as architects and planners in academia, so that we can also change and decolonize the education that we're getting in academia to really strive for what are solutions towards equity, what are solutions towards justice in the built environment. There's the Design as Protest organization started by Brian Lee that also brings together a coalition of designers to also just collaborate on projects that strive for equity and justice in the built environment. There's just a myriad. There's the Black Space Urbanist Collective, which is based in New York City. That's a coalition of Black urbanists and architects and also striving for equity and justice in the built environment. So I think what this moment right now has done is it hasn't fully started new organizations, but I think it's really charged organizations and open the doors for opportunities where people who have been doing this work can really get the support that they need to take it to the next level. And I'm really proud of the work that many of my fellow BIPOC architects and planners have been doing in this space.
Oh, so many questions that I want to follow up with, and I don't want to lose any of them. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but based on all of the work you're already doing, what is your ask of the colleagues who are not actually thinking as deeply about equity, are continuing to build, but are not plugging into these other institutional projects? Ifoma, let me start with you, and then I'll jump right to Jose.
That's a really brilliant question. And I think what I've seen happening in the industry is a lot of training programs, a lot of ways of bringing people into the conversation, helping them understand what is the challenge, like issues of redlining and redlining's impact on the ways our cities have grown and developed, like helping people, bringing people to reckon with that knowledge and history so that we can build for the future in a way that doesn't replicate the trauma caused in the past by the built environment. So I think that is definitely a space that I've seen just like a lot of growth and development happening.
Yeah, I want to raise something that was raised earlier in terms of kind of the non-siloed approach. I think that is of fundamental importance to really address this particular challenge. I think one thing too to recognize is that there are incredible organizations and incredible people that on a regular basis are trying to tackle these challenges. But I think more often than not, the solution is to create something new versus to really look towards the history and the work that's being done here to better inform the strategy for how we move forward. So, it's easy, I think, to immediately say, there's a challenge here that I want to address. It's a lot harder to look back and say, okay, this challenge has been addressed on multiple occasions before and is continually being addressed. And we need to learn from our past mistakes and help allow for that to inform our future. And so I think, that the purpose of us and the work that we're doing that intersects outside of the workforce space was really to better understand that we have taken as a sector in job training and economic development and reskilling and upskilling individuals for a very long time, an approach that is, we are the experts on this particular area. But if we're providing supportive services to people that include transit security, food security, housing, we're not the experts in that area, right? We need to be better informed by the individuals that are doing that work, and that can help us and in turn help everyone else that doing work around job training or has any questions around that. So I think more than anything right now, we need to just be gathering the best of our minds in our city. We need to be gathering, the emerging leaders that are on the cusp of really breaking out of their space, but can help better inform how we do better as a city overall, bring them all to the table and have a discussion. And that discussion, more importantly, I say emerging and it's not an ageist discussion as much as it's ensure that we're bringing people in to this discussion who are regularly left out of it because they don't have the power to be invited to the table. And so for us, it's about, having opportunities to progressively move this discussion forward. Because if we don't have a seat at the table and if we are not invited to the table, the challenge becomes how do we disrupt that table or break that table down instead of actually just participating along the lines of that discussion or trying to change the discussion to better advance the communities that we all serve.
Jose, you said the magic word at one point in there, which was power. And I think that this question of how power shows up in the proposed solution building is often inequitable. In other words, that we're often asking, designers do this, I think, in particular, and Ifoma, I think you might see if we share my perspective on this, that we often see the people who have been victimized by power as those that need to help solve the problem. And I wonder to what extent we're actually asking, how do we actually change how we are creating these scopes around change, that actually what we need to do is ask those who are perpetuating harm because they hold power and privilege to enact their own forms of reform rather than presume that the people who have been disenfranchised, marginalized, and harmed historically and in this moment to somehow be part of the solution building, which is not to say that the marginalized should not be solution building as well, but that the solutions are not always or only theirs to resolve. And I just want to add just this thought, which is, we often see the homeless, we want to sort of help the homeless as opposed to dismantling the systems of inequity around property ownership and the overvaluation of property that exacerbates and creates homelessness. So the homeless can't fix that problem, right? So how do we bring the right people to the table in the right ways to say, it is your power that is creating the problem here? Ifoma, would you pick up on that?
Man, you've brought just so many wonderful points to the conversation. I'm just like, which ones do I connect to? But no, absolutely. I'm so glad that, the concept of power has come into this conversation because it's so intricately linked with property and property relations and just the ways in which property has been weaponized against communities. And yes, so there needs to be this space of reckoning of just that and just legitimizing that happened. And that it is continuing to happen. And I think also, another aspect, I worked for the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, and we had this initiative called Neighborhood Set, where we would bring residents to the head of the table, actually. They would be responsible for creating policy documents that then get read to representatives from different government agencies. And so these policy documents express their explanation of the challenge from their lived experience, what they have been experiencing, and some strategies that they're offering that they can co-create or even hold government accountable for implementing. And in that space is where there's acknowledgement, and in that space, there's conversation and dialogue. Not all the problems are solved in that space, but at least there's a place where there's transparency and acknowledgement and a willingness to have a conversation about what the next step can be. And I think you're absolutely right. It shouldn't be one-sided. It should be all being able to contribute their expertise and resources and willpower, whatever it is that you have to bring to the table in order to shift things in a different direction. But yeah, the onus should not be put on the people who have been experiencing the trauma for so long. And so I like to use the term co-creation, where it sort of requires that, there's an understanding that we are all creating.
I want to say that I think co-creation requires that we trust and respect each other's skills, and that we don't use co-creation as a shield for, I tell you essentially what to do, how to do it, and why, and then you help me make that happen, right? You help to manifest it. And now I have some beautiful images that I can show that say, oh, but look, we co-created this. Yeah. So I think that in the context of workforce development, right, Jose, this is the space that it seems that you're working in. Is co-creation is about bringing people's skills, their work expertise onto the table to say everything has value.
Yeah, I think co-creation is key here. And I wanted to, just add a little bit more to kind of the whole power dynamics discussion. I don't think it's an either or, and I never think anything is really an either or. This solutions require different voices with different perspectives and different lived experiences to be at that table in order to address that challenge. It requires the people who are being affected, and then it requires the people who are affecting that. And without that, you end up finding a solution to the challenge for a particular portion of the population that will, in the end, be the only voice that's representing that particular change. And the other side of it is left to then fend that off and fight that off in the future. In order for progress to be made, we need multiple voices to address these challenges. And from a workforce standpoint, our members create jobs, connect underserved New Yorkers, primarily New Yorkers with low to moderate incomes, with multiple barriers to employment, and who have been left out of the growing economy due to systemic and historic marginalization. So we need, right now, especially more than ever, I think it's pretty clear, we need to serve our neighbors in their time of need. And we can't do that without increased resources and funding, which is critical to the city's recovery and the nation's recovery. But also, you mentioned this in terms of kind of the civic nature of this before. Civic participation is required by all of us involved in this particular challenge, and that that is an increasing challenge, I think, for folks that feel like the community or development or design is not suited to support their needs and their interest in a particular community. And I think that's critically important because, as I mentioned before, the more people left out of this discussion, it grows a larger portion of the population that is just disenfranchised and unhappy with their state and the positioning in the economy and their positioning in terms of their homes and their housing and everything that is meant to be secure and support their family growth. So I think economic development, a proper economic development vision, requires all of these different pieces. But from a workforce standpoint, we're trying to address that challenge by ensuring that people can develop power, have sustainable jobs and careers, and get themselves to a place where they can support their family, not just survive, but really thrive, and then have a transformative impact on their community without relying on others to do so for them.
You mentioned barriers to employment, which I think includes therefore barriers to change, as well as barriers to civic participation. I mean, let's talk about the moment that we're in. People feel overwhelmed. People feel as though change is not possible. People have lost the ability to hope for good reasons often, right? And so I wonder what you say to those who feel as though the barrier to entry for them is a sense of hopelessness. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the scales of participation. What does it mean for somebody to participate at a smaller scale where success maybe isn't a low-hanging fruit, but success feels more possible, that there are small changes that they can plug into? What does that look like in each of your spaces?
That's a great question. And I think it looks quite diverse. I mean, it can range from being a part of your community board and knowing what's happening in your community to being a part of events that civic organizations have in your community to also just connect. When I've been working in community engagement in this space, we try to diversify as much as possible the ways in which we reach out to people and understanding our current circumstances. So if you are connected to technology, we will reach out to you on Zoom and have Zoom meetings. If you're not connected to technology, then there are events that happen outside to bring people into the conversation. There are surveys that are online. There's mailing out handouts, surveys for people to fill in. And so I think it's up to both sides. If those who are empowered or in a position of decision making, to create as many avenues as possible to allow people to connect where they are. But then it's also for those who are feeling like they cannot connect in all ways, to just find the avenue where they can connect, or just find the opportunity where if it's not online, it's in an outdoor place. It's not trying to force yourself to overextend yourself in ways that are not comfortable, and honor of what you need. And so I think again, it's really about both parties coming to the table and offering a space for that exchange to happen.
Yeah, over the last year on our end and the workforce side, particularly, when COVID first struck us and shut down the city, it was, we were in the middle of what was, at the time, the focus was, and continues to be rightfully so, the health component. Then it quickly pivoted to a discussion around, the economics of the situation and how dire it was for so many of the populations that we often serve. And so it was inspiring from our perspective to see how many individuals and organizations came together to really address both of those challenges. But we felt that it was important for us to bring together not just individuals, but different organizations and individuals leading really important organizations to address this challenge together through partnership and collaboration. So we partnered with organizations that were focused on housing, education, technology, lots of other areas, and we conducted research in terms of drafting reports and kickstarted a bunch of different initiatives over the course of that year, including bringing in other folks in philanthropy, other areas of business, job training, elected officials, government agencies, et cetera. And in the process of doing that, we came together with a number of different recommendations that we felt that would help to kind of kickstart the discussion around how to get people back to work, but not just to get people back to work in the way it was, right? Really building back better became the terminology that we're all using and we've heard at a national level. We're really thinking about, it wasn't just about getting people back into the jobs that existed. We needed to think about, real growth. Look at the job quality that it was an issue beforehand and would continue to be an issue. We recognize that, when it comes to economic downturns, the populations that we serve the most usually do not benefit from the growth that usually occurs immediately following that. So we wanted to address that challenge head on and take a non-siloed approach to that discussion. But additionally, we held, and this is an opportunity that our members often participate on a regular basis, but we opened up our discussions so that everyone could be civically engaged. We didn't require our membership to be a part of it. We opened it up to partners, to friends, folks that were just interested in addressing this challenge around the future of work. And so we hosted discussions with 10 mayoral candidates, including the leading candidates right now who will be up for election in the next couple of weeks. We hosted discussions with elected officials at the congressional level and in the U.S. Senate. We hosted discussions with other leaders at the local level, and really opened the doors to everyone to be a part of that discussion in a way that could generate more information, new ideas. But I think at the lightest touch is just really showing up in whatever possible way that you can manage in your day. We recognize that not everyone has time to sit in front of a computer. And it hasn't, not everyone was considered, non-essential category, right? And they had to be at work. They had to be in the grocery. They had to be doing logistics to keep us home safe during those periods of time. So whenever you do have time, it does require, you to be engaged in whatever way, shape, or form you can in order to transform your community.
Yeah. Jose, Ifoma, thank you so much. We are actually at time, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. Can I just ask one last question, which is, do you feel hopeful? Do you think that we are on a good path toward change right now?
I feel really hopeful. And I think because what I'm seeing are organizations that were not talking about challenges around equity are now really centering that conversation. So that excites me. I hope it's sustainable. I hope, whatever the new normal is, when we get to that place, or the constantly evolving place, that this conversation will not die away, that we will continue to talk about iteratively, how do we deal with equity in our cities? And how do we use the built environment or workforce or the economy to do that?
Yeah, I'm by nature a hopeful person. I'm glad to hear same as my co-panelists here. And I think at the same time, I think what is important, though, is that we don't let the moment die. That everyone who stepped up and said that they wanted to support diversity and inclusion during this time, they wanted to support the lives of Black individuals who were historically marginalized and being hurt in the streets by a police enforcement system that wasn't serving them in an effective manner, that they continue to step up and be a part of the solutions, and don't allow for the moment to die. And so I'm very hopeful, and I know that we will continue this fight and ensure that we can create sustainable cities, but we need everyone to continue to do so as well.
Thank you. I completely agree, and I'm equally hopeful, and I'm very grateful to both of you for engaging in this conversation. Ifoma, Jose, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.